Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Mary Talk of the season. My name is Shirley Marty Hargis. I am an intelligence analyst with BAE Systems and and a senior research associate at Larus Consulting LLC. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Mary Talk featuring Dr. Elizabeth Larus as she presents the Chinese Dream and the New Silk Road. We are excited to welcome all participants of tonight's lecture, including those of you in the room with us, as well as a sizable virtual audience across the country and beyond. There will be time after the talk to ask questions, so keep that in mind as you listen to her presentation. Before we begin, a few words about tonight's presenter. Elizabeth Larus is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at UMW. Prior to coming to UMW in 1997, Dr. Larus worked as a press secretary on Capitol Hill and then lived in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. She's author of 2 books, Politics and Society in Contemporary China and Economic Reform in China, as well as more than 25 book chapters and scholarly articles. Professor Larus regularly presents papers at academic conferences throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia, and comments regularly in the International Public Policy Review. Her comments have appeared in the Financial Times, Fortune Magazine, El País Spain, Vedomosti Business Journal in Moscow, and Peking Agencia F.A. in Spain, among others. She regularly appears in international broadcast outlets, including BBC, CNBC, China Global News Network, Indus News in Pakistan, and Channel News Asia. In spring 2015, Dr. Larus was awarded a Taiwan Fellowship to conduct research on U.S. rebalance to the Asia Pacific. In 2019, Dr. Larus was awarded a Fulbright Scholar Grant to conduct research in Poland on China's New Silk Road in Europe. Most recently, Professor Larus was awarded the UMW 2019 Faculty Professional Achievement Award in recognition of her scholarly excellence. Dr. Larus speaks Mandarin and frequently conducts field research in Taipei, Beijing, and Shanghai. She holds a BA in journalism from Creighton University and an MA in public administration and PhD in government from the University of Virginia. Dr. Elizabeth Larus is also a former professor of mine and someone I admire greatly. She has become a prominent voice in the field of cross-strait relations, which is a passion we both share. She is the reason I was exposed to the Asia Pacific. She is the person that introduced me to the China-Africa relationship when she let me borrow her book, China and Africa by Chris Alden. She is the one who told me that there aren't many women in our field, and that if I really want to truly explore this, I should learn Mandarin. And now I speak Mandarin. I've had the pleasure of studying under her as a student and working alongside her as a colleague. As a person, she has a great sense of humor. She's caring, ambitious, and driven. And the first person I'll text at 10 p.m. sometimes about the latest news coming out of Taiwan and Hong Kong. I respect that she, as a woman, ensures that she has a seat at the table on discussions surrounding the Asia Pacific. I'm so very honored to be able to introduce this woman I admire, Dr. Elizabeth Larus.
Thank you. Good evening. From 1979 to at least 1997, China's economy grew at double digits, at least 10% a year for 20 years. And then, okay, well, it slowed down to like 8%, 7%, right? So for 30 years, China's enjoyed a really robust economy. So with that economic revitalization, now China has a lot of money, right, to seek national greatness once again. And so China is pouring money into national greatness. Also, that economic success story has made China more powerful. China is now the world's second largest economy, and it is increasingly powerful military. And so it is no longer humiliated. It is no longer weak. And it argues that during that 100 years of humiliation, which honestly would have ended in 49 when the communists came to power, but for many years after that, China had to catch up. And so China, in the process of catching up, is saying that now we are stronger. Now we can make good on the promises that we made to the people. We always wanted to be a stronger military. We always wanted to assert sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. Back in 1992, when the Chinese government passed a law that the entire South China Sea, all the waters in it and all the land structures in it belonged to China, it was laughable because they could not follow through. They just didn't have that power. They're becoming pretty close to be able to do so. Okay. So, of course, realizing the Chinese dream, national rejuvenation is all under the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. It is the CCP's role to lead the people. The people then obey the party. If they want a stronger country, they all have to move forward together. And that's what the Communist Party has been doing since 1979. It has been moving the entire country and the entire population forward. Most of the Chinese support the party, they support the government, they support Xi Jinping. He is wildly popular. His agenda is wildly popular in China because of what the party has done and because of the party's vision. Now, the CCP, in order to move the entire population forward, needs to have very strict control over the population. And of course, that means control of the media, control of the, well, of course, the military. Again, the party controls the military, control of any type of trade operations going on in the country, control of society, etc. Here, I think, is a really nice visual, a really nice takeaway from the idea of the Chinese dream. The Chinese characters are actually Chinese sailors on formation on China's first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. China has actually 2 aircraft carriers now. They're building a 3rd one. This is the first one. And the Chinese characters read, China dream, strong China military dream. China knows to achieve the Chinese dream, that is rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation, it needs to have military power, but specifically, it needs to have naval power. China knows that every great power since antiquity has been a sea power. And so China is pursuing sea power. It is putting tremendous investment into its navy and air power. And so, again, I think this really brings it all together. Now, of course, why do great powers seek sea power? Sea power protects a country's economic power. Most trade is seaborne. So to protect that seaborne trade, countries need to have a strong merchant marine, a strong navy. And to have a strong navy, they need to have docking stations, ports, around the world for replenishment, refueling, and things of that nature. So all of that is part of the Chinese dream. The Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road that I'm going to get to in a minute, is just the latest step in China's going out policy. The going out policy, again, is essential to support to see the Chinese dream come to fruition. So what is the going out policy? Around the year 2000, Chinese leaders determined that it was important for China to pursue foreign markets for its goods. As you know, China had become a factory to the world. Foreign factories are there, but China has many of its own factories. And particularly its state-owned enterprises were producing so much, partly to employ people, but were producing a surplus of goods that they needed to find foreign markets. So where are you going to go? Well, one place to go is to southward, right, Southeast Asia, and then another way for China to go would be westward, right, over into the, at that time, newly independent Central Asian republics, into Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and over to the Middle East and Africa as well. And so the going out policy, again, has been in progress now for about 20 years. I'm rounding there. So its intent is to expand markets so China can export its goods worldwide, and also to magnify China's global presence. That is like a forward deployment. We are here, we are on the world stage, we trade like the rest of the first world nations. So this is the BRI, the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the latest step in the going out strategy. As you can see, the BRI has two components. The first I'm going to talk about is the overland economic belt. That runs from China, mostly from Xi'an, just southwest of Beijing there, and it goes all the way to London. All right, this ends around Rotterdam or something like that, but it actually goes all the way to London. Notice that it crosses those stands in the Central Asian Republic, and it goes through Eastern Europe, Central Europe, onto Western Europe. The overland economic belt is made up of highways, railways, and pipelines, oil and gas pipelines for China's energy needs to keep this whole thing moving. The other component is the maritime road. And as you can see, that starts from coastal China, generally southern coastal China. It goes southward through South China Sea to Southeast Asia, over to South Asia, which is India and Pakistan, over to the Middle East. Iran is a big player in this, and then down to Djibouti, Kenya, and then all the way up to the Suez area. And so it is not completely global, but it certainly encompasses all of Eurasia as well as Africa, and of course the Middle East. It is a huge infrastructure project. Huge is an understatement. Initial estimates for the BRI, the New Silk Road, is about $1 trillion, but it really could be a multi-trillion-dollar project. How is this carried out? China will go to countries along the route and say, do you want to participate? Do you want to be along this massive route that will facilitate an exchange of goods? China will send products, exports, through these highways, these railways, and then the countries that are participating will send their goods to China. China has a huge market. It has a population of 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of buyers. And so a lot of the participants, to date, 84 countries are participating in some way, shape, or form. Certainly more, some more than others. And so a lot of the countries who want to participate don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the highways. They don't have the railways for the exchange of goods. So China says, okay, we will come and we will build them. We will build them for you to facilitate this massive trade. Well, how are the countries going to pay for this? Countries borrow money from China to hire Chinese companies to build the highways and the railways. So much, if not most, of the construction going on along the BRI whether it be, the overland highways, railways, or the seaports, are being done by Chinese companies. 10 of the world's 12 largest construction companies are Chinese state-owned construction companies. And so they see the BRI as a huge opportunity for them to stay in business, to employ people. And so again, an Eastern European country, for example, Romania, Hungary, just pick an Eastern European country because they're all in it. They borrow from China, and then they pay the Chinese companies to come in, usually with Chinese labor, to build the highways, the roads, the transport centers, the ports. Of course, you can imagine this has run into some resentment in some areas because very often the Chinese companies are not hiring locals. And of course, the Chinese companies argue, well, we don't know the language, they don't know our language, it's just easier to bring our own people in, we'll get it done faster, and it'll be a good product. Okay. Again, let me get back to the issue of the pipelines. As I mentioned, one key component of the overland economic belt are oil and gas pipelines, which are running from the Caspian Sea all the way to China. These are absolutely vital for China's continued economic growth and prosperity. And so China has been negotiating with Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan to build these pipelines for both gas and oil. One component of this is that China is becoming a bit more skittish, of course, of relations with the United States. The United States and China has been embroiled in a trade war since 2018, but even before that, when China was becoming assertive in the South China Sea, again, making good on that 1992 law saying the whole thing belongs to us, the United States started to push back. And China figured out very quickly that if the United States got enough of its maritime allies in the Asia-Pacific together, we could bottle up coastal China, eastern coastal China. And so for its security, for its energy security, it was prudent, it made sense for them to look westward. This partly explains the warming relations between the US and Russia. Between China and Russia. China and Russia historically have had actually very testy relations, but the need for energy is warming up some of those relations. I want to talk about a couple of major projects that are part of the maritime road. Gwadar is a port in Pakistan. It is, honestly, it's both on the maritime road as well as the overland economic belt. I'm going to talk about the port in particular as a part of the maritime section. Gwadar, 5 years ago, was a sleepy fishing village. Not much going on there at all. China determined, looking at geography, that this was a key place for transport between East and West. China recently has had very good relations with Pakistan, and the Pakistan government agreed that China could build this massive port at Gwadar. This, of course, is upsetting India, because India-Pakistan relations are quite testy and have been since partition in 1947. The overland portion of the Gwadar project, which comes from China, goes through disputed territory between India and China and India and Pakistan, okay? So it's vital for that overland portion that it go through this disputed territory. So it's really upsetting a lot of people, particularly India. Okay. So once Gwadar is built, it will be one of the largest ports in Asia, and it'll be controlled by China. Pakistan will still own it, but China will control it. The fear here in Washington is that it could be used as a naval port at some point. Both Pakistan and China deny that, but that is something that is of concern to Washington. Another example of a major project going on is the port in Colombo, Sri Lanka, just off of India. China has completed building a massive port there. So the government in Sri Lanka borrowed money from China. The Chinese built it, the Chinese finished it, but as you know, loans need to be paid back, right? Well, the idea was after, it would be so economically viable, the government in Sri Lanka would make so much money, they would be able to pay it back. Well, it's not drawing the business. This huge port is not drawing the business that they had anticipated as early as they anticipated. So remember, Sri Lanka is in tremendous debt to China. So China said, okay, we understand that you cannot pay this back. We will essentially take some collateral, and that is give us a 99-year lease on this port. And the government of Sri Lanka said, fine, deal. And so China now controls and essentially owns, leases it for 99 years. Okay, so the fear is that this is going to happen in many other places. Another place that China is building, where China is building a huge port, is the ports in Djibouti. Djibouti is near Somalia in Eastern Africa. We have a base there. China now has a base there. The Italians have a base there. A lot of people have bases there. Djibouti is the US's eyes and ears on Somalia and that area, okay, in the Middle East. China is building a huge port in Djibouti. Again, that government, which is poor, is borrowing billions of dollars. Of course, we're not talking thousands and millions, right? Billions of dollars from China to build this massive port. Djibouti has borrowed so much that its debt to China is worth 79% of its GDP. How is Djibouti going to pay China back for this? Okay. And so now you could see, right, the fear. Now you can see some, people looking around the world like, this is a fabulous, on paper, it's a fabulous program to be a part of. Participant countries, particularly the ones that have the most to gain, the poorer countries, as well as Central and Eastern Europe, right, will have to pay this back at some point and are getting into tremendous debt. Debt to China has skyrocketed since this whole BRI was initiated in 2013. So much so that IMF chief Christine Lagarde has warned that the BRI is a debt trap. Not necessarily for every participant, but for a lot of countries, it will be a debt trap. This is, on your computer, this is an interactive type tracker that indicates the amount of debt that countries are going into to participate in BRI. The darker the color, the larger the debt. Djibouti is so small in Africa, and I'm not able to get the, ooh. Well. Well, ignore that. Yeah, I'll just talk about Djibouti. All right, yeah, so I already mentioned Djibouti is in debt to China, about 79% of its GDP. Mongolia, about 49%. Sri Lanka, 10%. Cambodia, 20%. These are relatively, thank you, these are relatively poor countries, thank you, that are, you can see, increasingly in debt to China. But they are getting world-class highways, railways, ports that they could not build themselves. They could not and will not. So there is a tremendous benefit to participating in the BRI. Of course, this is why countries want to participate. And again, there are 84 countries participating to a certain extent. Now, as Shirley mentioned, I will be in Poland on a Fulbright in the spring. And so I will research China's investments in Poland, or Poland's participation in the BRI. Eastern European countries and Central European countries are very enthusiastic about participating in the BRI because they have the most to gain. That is, of the European countries, they have the most to gain. They still have the furthest to develop. They do not already have high-speed rail. They do not already have the highways to the extent, right, and the ports and the trading exchanges that the railway terminals, that China can build for them. So now, while Central and Eastern Europe is excited about this, and particularly the small and medium-sized businesses are excited about BRI because they can all have a part in this. And remember, their goods get to be shipped to China. The railways that are being built are going to be a direct line to China. So imagine if you want to ship foodstuffs that need to go in refrigerated train cars, or fast fashion that's changing almost daily. Your goods need to be transported quickly. And so the BRI is going to get your goods to that consumer, that 1.4 million people consumer market in China. And you're going to get some pretty good, lower priced Chinese manufactured goods. Now, Western Europe, what we call the core of European Union, France, Great Britain, Germany, are a bit more skittish because they see not only the debt that comes along with it, but they see tons of cheap Chinese, inexpensive Chinese manufacturers coming into their country to compete with their goods. In the United States, we have gotten so used to going shopping, and we see so much is made in China, right? Only like 2% of our footwear is actually made in the United States. The rest is imported. About 90% of what's imported comes from China. A lot of our textiles, plastics, I don't have to tell you this, right? But in Europe, not as much that you buy in the stores there is made in China. They still actually make stuff in Europe, okay? And so what they see is more and more inexpensive, but increasingly high quality Chinese goods coming in to compete with their industries. What they're also nervous about is not only does this going out policy and the Belt and Road, the new Silk Road, expand Chinese markets, but it expands Chinese influence, right? Power is the ability to influence others. And so China now has a tremendous presence all over the globe. Anywhere you go, Africa, Latin America, Europe, there are Chinese companies. Even in the smallest towns in Poland, there are representatives from Chinese businesses saying, what do you need? I can get it to you faster cheaper than Germany can, Switzerland, that, by the way, has all those regulations. And so if you need a spare part for optical goods, I can get that to you fast. And that's very, very attractive. So with influence, China is expanding not only its power, but also its feel-goodness, its fuzziness. More and more people are interacting with Chinese. They're working for Chinese businesses. They're working for Chinese banks in Warsaw, in Berlin, in Budapest. And so they have a favorable impression of China. Europeans have a more favorable impression of China than we do in the United States now. And so this Belt and Road, this new Silk Road, is also expanding China's soft power. And that is countries, peoples want to emulate you because they like your values. They see you as a model. Look at the Chinese economy, right? At the beginning of this talk, I said it grew at rates of 10% for at least 20 years, and then around 8, 9% for about 30 years. That is an economic success story. A lot of countries around the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, would like that too. And so they're looking at China as at least an economic model. They're not so concerned about the politics, right? But the Belt and Road, you know, again, it projects a very positive image of China. So there are a lot of benefits for a lot of countries by participating in the BRI, but you can also see there are literally the costs. So I will entertain any questions if you would like to ask them. Yeah, okay, start right up front here. Yeah.
Can I give you a mic? So the people online can.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm a local during the week for work, but I grew up in the area. It was a great talk, really enlightening.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your research. I'm just curious, the countries that take advantage of the BRI, are they able to use the railroads for other personal internal uses, like client or customer transport, or is it only for trade with China?
These are mostly like freight cargo type trains. Yeah, not for like intercity passenger traffic. Now, that said, China is building some high-speed railways in like Malaysia, for example, and that will primarily be passenger traffic, and that specific project is a BRI project. So yeah, so there is most of the railways are for cargo, but a few are passenger.
Sure. I'm just going to sit right here.
And then I was just curious, sorry, another question about the projects in Central and Eastern Europe. Are those governments projected to more likely be able to pay back the loans, or do you think that those eventually, they might befall the same fate as some of the poor, less developed countries?
Yeah, that remains to be seen because a lot of the projects are in the state of agreement. You know, China and companies in Poland have signed what's called MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding. And so right now, like Poland's debt to China is 0.2% of its GDP. But, you know, like in actual dollars at some point, you know, translate that to real dollars. So those countries, you know, they have more thriving economies. You know, Poland is actually the fastest growing economy in Europe. So they will have a better chance of paying back, but it depends on the scale, the scope of the projects that they get involved in. It's a good question.
Can we jump to an online question really quickly? Cullen from Richmond, a 1990 grad, asks, does the U.S. and the West generally have much to fear from the Silk Road? Isn't commerce, generally speaking, part of the international order that's kept the peace and encouraged international engagement and interdependence?
Sure. Trade can certainly bring about like understanding. The more you are trading with other countries, the more you understand them. But no, trade does not inoculate countries from war, right? Go back to before World War I and then the interwar period, where countries were, you know, on the continent, France, Germany, all those, you know, countries, they had robust trade, but they did, you know how that story ended, right? Okay. But of course, this is what powers do. This is what economic powers do. They trade, right? So the United States is, well, it's certainly concerned about China as a rival power. It is concerned by China's influence because, as I mentioned, most of the countries, of course, they're looking at the economic component, right? They're saying we have a lot to benefit from this, and by the way, if we follow your model of economic growth and development, then we might, grow as you did. What we have found is in the countries, even before the BRI, in the countries where China was giving, foreign aid, there was a higher incidence of incarceration of journalists and political dissidents than in countries that didn't benefit or didn't take a Chinese foreign aid. And so what is happening is, and what the United States doesn't like, and what the West doesn't like, is that Chinese aid, Chinese investment, BRI money props up dictatorships, and it emboldens non-democratic governments because they're getting the money, but they don't have to make any kind of political reforms that they would have to do if they were getting US and Western money. That's like money from Japan and countries in Western Europe. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay, sorry. My name is Gunnar Riedel. I'm dad of one of the students here.
Yeah, I don't think it's on, or hold it closer. Or shout.
So, apart from the benefits that the Chinese military will get from improved economics, are there strategic implications militarily for the routing that the Chinese have taken for the overland route or the priorities for their maritime?
Okay, great, yeah. So if you didn't hear that, is there a military benefit for China, right? Does the BRI have military benefits for China? Certainly there are scholars who are looking at that, right? The Pentagon, of course, is looking at that. To date, we cannot substantially say, yeah, Chinese military is going to use that, use at least the overland belt. But the ports are a concern. As I said, Djibouti, for example, China already has a base in Djibouti. Now it has a port, right? It would not be unusual, though, for militaries to use ports that, China builds, right? Great navies do port, and they make port calls, around the world. And so, yeah, it is quite possible that there is a military component to this. It may have been envisioned, of course, by the Chinese government. They're not going to announce it now, right? But it certainly can smooth the way. Again, I see it more if it happens along the maritime road than the overland belt. Again, because China wants to be a sea power, and the areas that it's most interested in being a sea power is the Middle East, the South China Sea, right? China isn't as concerned about being a military power in Tajikistan, right? Yeah, it's more in the oceans.
Hi, you mentioned the soft influence that China has on the world, and you also mentioned the textiles and how so much of the things that I guess we wear that are produced in China. Does China have any soft influence in aesthetics in the world from a design standpoint? For example, if you read if I read GQ, I might see pictures from the Harajuku districts in Japan,
Yeah.
and how it influences us over here and many major European cities. Does China have that type of influence at all currently?
All right. I don't see fashion, but tattoos. Have you noticed the Chinese characters in tattoos? That's a perfect
I'm referring to fashion, so
Yeah.
no.
I'm sorry?
I'm referring to fashion mainly.
Yeah. Not so terribly much. No. They're producing for a Western market, so they're producing what Westerners wear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you think it hasn't been an impetus for design?
I don't know. You actually probably know the answer better than I do, right? If you're interested in fashion, I do not follow fashion. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. No, Shanghai has some like fabulous fashion houses. Why they have not gained a lot of traction in the West is a very good question that I can't answer.
Okay.
With all this trade,
Yes.
how much corruption is going on in China? And the second, and I've got a follow-on question is that, what is the disparity in income between the highest paid and the lowest paid in the countries that China adopts?
Okay, so corruption. One of the reasons why Xi Jinping is wildly popular in China is because the first thing he did when he came in was start an anti-corruption campaign. And he did he imprisoned a lot of people. Were some of them his political rivals? Yes, but many, many others were not. And, of course, the Chinese don't publicly talk about corruption. They're not going to put it in their media, right? So how do we know the extent of it? Has it increased because of BRI? I don't know. What I do know is that a lot of people are very much afraid of being caught afraid of being caught engaging in corrupt practices. And so maybe it's even more under the table than it was before. But his anti-corruption campaign has been very, very public. And it captured not just the little fish, but the big fish as well. And some of them have been executed. And so that's pretty frightening. And so a lot of people are like, okay, hands off of that kind of stuff. So your second question was income disparity in the countries that are participating in Belt and Road. Income disparity between like the people who live there and who and the
people that basically are handling the money for the Chinese.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, it's quite large. It's quite large. The income disparities are quite large. Again, that's why it rankles a lot of the countries that China is hiring Chinese workers. They're not just bringing Chinese workers from China. They're bringing like Chinese food from China, Chinese chefs, right? Because a lot of Chinese, they cannot digest Western food. Really, they can't. And so they're bringing over food from China, kitchens, chefs, housing, materials. Many of the Belt and Road participants now have Chinatowns throughout them because those are the Chinese, enclaves. They have Chinese small businesses, right? Imagine you're a businessman in China and you know that there's some huge port being built in Gwadar. Well, you might just bring over your business over there, right? And so, yes, there is a tremendous disparity there, and there is resentment. Yeah.
TPP was in large part designed to cope with Belt and Road, as I understand it, and then ran into heavy weather, not in China, but in the United States.
Right.
What did the Chinese make of it?
Oh, they were jumping up and down. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to be the largest free trade agreement ever. There were about 17 countries or so along the Pacific Rim. So it's going to be a huge free trade agreement amongst Pacific Rim countries, including the United States. So it was like United States, Chile, Japan, Taiwan wanted in, but not China. And so the Obama administration talked about it, but never brought it before Congress. And President Trump, when he was a candidate, said, that's going to be dead when I get in. And so because he was concerned, again, that it would bring in cheaper goods that would compete with American goods. And remember when he was campaigning, he wanted to save American jobs because so many millions of jobs had gone to China, right? And so he's like, well, we're not doing that again. And so, so China was actually quite thrilled, right, when the United States didn't move the ball forward on that one.
I'd just like to hear your comments on that the aid of China is offering to the Caribbean disaster of the Dorian hurricane they went through. They're offering to rebuild these nations.
Yeah.
Just your comments on that.
I should ask you.
It's not-
Like,
it's-
okay,
It's
so
not trade necessarily, but they are offering in our own backyard, so to speak,
Yeah.
the rebuilding.
and that's a very good example of soft power. It's an illustration of soft power, right? That China is contributing, you know, billions of dollars to rebuilding the Bahamas that were, you know, struck down by the hurricane, right? China has sent the equivalent of the Comfort and Mercy, you know, ships to disaster zones. And so this gives people a very positive image of China, right? Bahamas is not in China's backyard. What interest does China have in Bahamas? I don't think that it's going to rebuild it and put a base there, right? But again, it's that soft power. It's that image building that not only are we strong, but we are good, right? And Bahamas and people, they're going to be grateful, right? And the rest of the world is going to look and they're going to, it's a great thing to do, right? Sure.
With the BRI, China is investing substantially into all of these other countries with somewhat risky chances of any of those loans being paid back. If these projects in the long term aren't successful and China ends up losing a lot of money because of that, would that undermine Xi and the broader CCP's legitimacy?
Yeah, thank you. I am so glad that you mentioned that because, again, some of the skepticism regarding the new Silk Road is that many of these projects are wildly expensive. They're just like they're over expensive, you know, more than they really should cost, and may not be economically viable, right? So, for example, the port in Sri Lanka, that's going to take perhaps decades until it's really economically viable. What we have also found is that some countries have been able to renegotiate with China. For example, in Malaysia, I don't know if you remember, Muhammad Mahathir was Prime Minister of Malaysia back in the late 80s through around like 91 or so. He made a comeback last year. The guy's 91 years old. And Malaysia, the previous Malaysian government, which was very corrupt, had signed a number of agreements with China, very, very expensive agreements. And so Mahathir came in and said, we're going to, you know, recalculate this. And he went to the Chinese and he said, cut it in half. This is too expensive. And the Chinese did. And so they will negotiate, you know, and they will relook at deals if you can, you know, sit down with them. But it's true that a lot of these may not be paid back to China. And that's a concern. You know, Chinese economy is still growing, right? But the rate of growth is slowing down. It's an aging population. And China itself is in tremendous debt, domestic debt, right? So many people, so many businesses, so many banks have overborrowed that it's a real concern there. So yes, a real concern is that a lot of these projects will go bust. And some scholars say, like, you know, we shouldn't be so concerned. Washington shouldn't be so worried about this because a lot of it might not come to fruition. But I tell you, China has foreign reserves of over $3 trillion. What I could do with $3 trillion, right? And so they can put a lot of money into this. They can suffer losses until some of these projects become, you know, viable. You know, who knows, you know, something that's not viable now might be, you know, down the road, may have been a good investment.
The expanding Chinese economy is underpinned by fossil fuels. And with the development of the pipeline from Europe for oil, there's a geopolitical question that comes out. Just as Europe is dependent on oil from the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, Europeans and EU are held hostage. What would China do to inoculate itself so that it wouldn't be held hostage by the oil suppliers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, it still gets most of its oil from the Middle East, and so it has good relations with most Middle Eastern countries. And so then these oil and gas pipelines, supplement. But also, China, as I mentioned, claims the entire South China Sea and regularly carries out, seismic tests and carries out exploratory missions there. The problem is in the South China Sea, China's running into Vietnam. It's doing its own exploring. So we don't know how much oil and gas reserves there are in the South China Sea, but that's another reason why China very much wants to control that whole area. It's all about economic security, right? The Communist Party will only stay in power so long as China has economic security. So they're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that that Chinese economy is humming along. But also, China is investing as the world's greatest investor in solar energy. They also have wind power. They have tremendous amounts of hydroelectric power. And so they're developing biomass energy because they're aware of the limits, of fossil fuels. But also they're aware of the pollution in China, that a growing middle class is saying, enough, we don't want to breathe this in. We're raising our kids, and this is literally deadly. And so China is looking at alternative energy sources for the environment, but also for security, energy security, for economic security.
My question doesn't have to do with the Belt Road, but doesn't China own a lot of our foreign debt? Here in the United States, a large part of our foreign debt is owned by China.
China is the U.S.'s second largest owner of, China is the U.S.'s second.
We owe the second part of our.
No, I'm not saying this right. Okay. Foreign, okay.
Our foreign debt is.
Foreign holder.
Yes.
China is U.S.'s second largest foreign holder of our debt. Yeah. Most American debt is held by Americans. Yeah. Right. Okay. And so then the remainder is held by foreigners. Back in the 70s, it was the Dutch, believe it or not. Then in the 80s, it was the Japanese. In recent years, the Chinese. Last time I checked, as of like about 3 weeks ago, it was the Japanese again. So, but yes, they do hold a lot of U.S. debt, which means that we're economically tied together there, right? We may, reduce our trade and investment, but the debt situation. China doesn't want the U.S. economy to tank, right? Because they have a bunch of debt. That's not good for them either, right? And so, yeah, they hold the debt, but it's a double-edged sword. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and I think we should let a student have the final question.
All right, so is this working? Okay, cool. So I was just wondering, because I heard you mention multiple times about like Latin America, smaller Latin American countries being affected by the BRI, but I never really got to hear more about it. Perhaps you could elaborate more on this. So I was just wondering, because I heard you mention multiple times about like Latin America, smaller Latin American countries being affected by the BRI, but I never really got to hear more about it. Perhaps you could elaborate more on this.
Yeah, that's because China's investing in other places a lot more, right? But Latin America is relatively, new to the game of Chinese investment. China is investing a lot in Brazil. Out of all the countries in South America, it is Brazil, and then of course some of the other countries. Right now, what China is getting from Brazil is minerals, right, and other natural resources. And so China, like in Africa before, is primarily engaged in extractive industries in Latin America. And that is, Brazil has tremendous amounts of bauxite that's used in industry, tin, and many other things that are used for industry. Of course, coal, not so much timber anymore because that has to be certified for furniture. But China makes a lot of furniture, so it gets some woods from Latin America. And so that is certainly poised to increase because a lot of the countries there are very enthusiastic about Chinese investment. And so they have signed a number of MOUs with Beijing. And so I expect that we will see a pretty rapid increase pretty soon in Chinese investment in Latin America.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you again for joining us both in person and digitally for tonight's presentation. At this time, I believe the Alumni Association has a small gift they'd like to present to Dr. Larus.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. We hope. We hope you will mark your calendars for our next Mary Talk, which will be on Wednesday, November 13th at 7 p.m. Dr. Brooks Kirkendall, professor and chair of the music department, will present Frank Sinatra in the development of the concept album. For now, we invite you to stay and enjoy some refreshments before departing. Thank you and have a good night.